Believe half of what you see and none of what you hear. Edgar Allan Poe. Since its creation and release in 1981 and 1983, The Evil Dead and its sequels, Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness, have become an absolute cult phenomenon, to the point that a sequel TV series, Ash vs. Evil Dead, ran for 3 seasons on Starz and became the most pirated TV show ever, not to mention the remake in 2013 directed by Fede Alvarez, Evil Dead Rise in 2023, and a small handful of video games. The series' director and mastermind Sam Raimi would also go from directing cult films like Darkman and Darkman 2 to helming the Spider-Man films of the early 2000s, and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness in 2022, which I still haven't seen because time is a black hole. It's pretty safe to say that most of the creative minds behind the Evil Dead franchise have gone on to have fulfilling careers. I mean, a good majority of Raimi's films include a cameo from our friend Bruce. While The Evil Dead was a big success for its time and was certainly influential, not to mention extremely controversial, Evil Dead 2 took things to a whole new level. The film has been called the greatest horror film ever made by horror fans and bloggers alike, and while that certainly sounds like hyperbole, it's a claim that's not without merit. Because, as we're going to find out in this month's deep dive, many of your favorite horror films might not have been made without the influence of this cult classic. Welcome back to Storyrant. I'm Eric Malikyte, your resident cosmic horror madman, author of such novels as Echoes of Olympus Mons, Mind's Horizon, and upcoming ones such as Cthulhu Grimoire and Color Out of Interstellar Space. My cosmic horror stories have appeared in the Books of Cthulhu anthologies from Macabre Inc., and Grimdark Magazine published one of my cyberpunk stories earlier this year. I'm a lifelong student and lover of storytelling across a wide gambit of genres and mediums. And with that out of the way, let's get into this mess, shall we? Today, Bruce Campbell is practically a household name with horror fans, having developed a solid reputation as one of horror's only successful or memorable final boys, as the horror genre on film back in the 80s and 90s was almost singularly focused on strong female characters, to the point that many horror essayists and writers, including myself, have analyzed the positives and negatives of the final girl trope in the genre. The original Evil Dead film didn't exactly set the world on fire when it was first premiered at the Redford Theater in Raimi's home city of Detroit, Michigan in 1981. But this screening did attract producer Irvin Shapiro, who helped get the film screened at the 1982 Cannes Film Festival. The Evil Dead wouldn't be off to the races until Stephen King saw it at this festival and absolutely fucking loved it. The most ferocious original film of the year. This attracted New Line Cinema's attention. They picked up the rights to distribute the film, and The Evil Dead finally got its official theatrical release in 1983. It's no secret that the original Evil Dead film was a massive financial success. A serious feat when you consider that the MPAA slapped the film with an X rating that really should have hurt its chances at the box office. But Stephen King's blessing and strong word of mouth eventually led to the film grossing about $2.4 million worldwide, against a budget of about $375,000. While critical reception was almost completely positive, and the quote from Stephen King did give the film a big marketing push, I mean, it's on the movie poster for a reason, upon being released on home video, it sparked a massive controversy upon release. The Evil Dead became the target of an intense censorship campaign in the UK, something that could be seen as comparable to the Satanic Panic of the 1980s here in the US. But instead of targeting Dungeons and Dragons and heavy metal, this outrage campaign led by Mary Whitehouse targeted the distribution of pornography and films like Cannibal Holocaust, which deserves its reputation because it involves real on-screen animal violence and death, labeling the whole truckload of films as video nasties. And like the Satanic Panic of the 80s, the campaign was hypocritical as fuck, and relied on flawed arguments, to say the least. At one point, Whitehouse even claimed that children were watching these video nasties and replicating the acts shown on screen, something that has never been shown to be true. This woman managed to get some very powerful and wealthy individuals on her side, such as the dipshit who ran the Daily Mail, a right-wing tabloid that you should never, ever take seriously, and a bunch of politicians as well. Like, Imagine having your home raided and all the police take is a copy of Grand Theft Auto 5 because some dipshit in Washington finds it offensive. That's what actually happened with the films that violated the 1959 Obscenity Publications Act. Shops and homes were actually raided, and Sam Raimi was slapped with a frickin' obscenity charge. The point is, The Evil Dead made serious waves in the 80s, and while some of the attention it received wasn't exactly positive, a lot of it was. Despite the original film's flaws, it's still one of the most inventive independent horror films ever made. The original Evil Dead had a long road to release and eventual success. A short film called Within the Woods was created as a proof of concept, where Raimi and his buddies experimented with the inventive POV shots that would become so iconic in the Evil Dead franchise. This technique is inventive as hell, too. Basically, Sam and his friends placed their camera in the center of a 2x4. The length of the board corresponded to a general reduction in how much the camera shook. Seriously, Sam was cooking from the very beginning. And while this is a video about Evil Dead 2, we really can't jump into talking about that film without breaking down the original, can we? This will also be important when we get to talking about the differences between the portions of Evil Dead 2 that reinterpret scenes from the original, because there are a lot of differences. Speaking of differences, the title sequence of The Evil Dead bleeds right into one of these POV shots, where the evil stalks our group of hapless 20-somethings as they take a ride up to the cabin and almost make closer than friends with a semi-truck. It's often said that Evil Dead as a franchise prides itself on turning popular tropes of the genre on their heads. From the very first frame, the main characters are in danger. I could certainly stand to have more horror films that take this approach. Even though Evil Dead 2 is technically a remake, depending on who you talk to, of course, it chooses not to replicate this sequence, even though the opening title sequence does hint at the POV shots that would come later on in the film's runtime. Even the arrival at the cabin in the original film is tense. It's shot in daylight, and yet because of its slow, methodical pacing and the use of a creeping tone in the score, the audience is immediately put on edge. In particular, the swing that bangs against the tree stopping as Ash and friends approach the cabin is a really nice touch. It's pretty clear at this point that these 20-somethings have made a big mistake by coming here. Fun fact, the cabin Raimi and his crew rented out for the shoot of the original film was actually rumored to be haunted. While nothing weird happened on set, the cabin was struck by lightning and burned to the ground after filming wrapped. While the rest of her friends settle in for their getaway in the woods, Cheryl, Ash's sister, unwinds by drawing a clock on the wall. The clock stops and she hears a disembodied voice invite her to join us. Cheryl loses control of her hand and carves the hell out of the sketch pad, which apparently leaves a face, but I've never been able to see it. It just looks like a bunch of random carvings in the sketch pad. To me, at least. The camera work here is really inventive. I love the close-up shots of the clock's pendulum and how they play on shots of the actor. And inventive is a great way to describe a large majority of this film. It's almost always punching above its budget. And really, that's exactly what you want from a low-budget horror film, right? But I think one of the few complaints I have with the original film is that sometimes the score can be pretty cheesy. Yeah, even though Evil Dead 2 is a comedy, I do think its score is slightly better. The moment where the cellar door pops open on its own would have been more powerful had it been done in silence. The cheesy synthesizer kind of undercuts the tension, as Ash and friends go from enjoying a quiet dinner around the table to wondering what the hell that sound was coming from the living room. Scotty goes into the cellar to see if anyone's down there and stops responding to Ash and the others. Ash goes in after him, carrying a lantern, and we get a really nice arc shot of the whole cellar. If you were a teen watching this film in the 80s, you'd probably think that something terrible was about to happen. But when Ash hears a sound on the other side of a door down in there and goes to check it out, his friend scares the crap out of him. Also, I'm going to continue my trend of pointing out that this is a jump scare without a musical cue. We need more of this in modern horror flicks. Scotty shows Ash a bunch of stuff he found down there, including Chekhov's shotgun and shells, a strange tattered book with a demonic face on it, and an ornately carved dagger. They also find a cassette player and return to Linda and the others. They play the tape, and the phenomena outside seems to be affected by it. The tape is basically a play on the classic autobiographical Lovecraftian trope of having some man of science tell us about the horrifying things he discovered. Dr. Raymond Noby. They say The Evil Dead isn't a comedy. Tells our 20-somethings that he found an ancient Sumerian grimoire, the Notorum Demonto, or the Book of the Dead. It wouldn't be called the Necronomicon Ex Mortis until the next film. This freaks Cheryl out and they stop playing the tape. But Scotty, being the resident douchebag of the group, decides to keep playing it anyway. Cheryl loses it during the incantation and she screams at Scott to stop the recording. A tree breaks the window and Scotty and Ash get into an argument. I find it interesting that rather than having the demonic activity be caused directly by the recording, the film chooses instead to have it escalate when it's played. It's like the Kandarian demon is just chilling outside doing its best impression of Mr. Burns, waiting for it to be played before it shows its hand. After the argument with Scotty, everyone splits up. Ash and Linda have a moment. Linda decides to check on Cheryl, and Ash pretends to fall asleep on the couch with a gift box conveniently placed on his knee. This scene is pretty endearing too, and it's sold almost entirely by close-up shots of Ash and Linda's eyes playing back and forth off of each other like a game of cat and mouse. Linda will look at the box, look at Ash, and then look back, and Ash will open his eyes before Linda looks at him and then goes back to feigning sleep. Did I mention that Sam Raimi and his team were cooking? When Ash finally gets caught, Linda smacks him on the shoulder playfully before opening the box containing a silver necklace. Remember when I said that you need genuine human moments in horror stories in order to get your audience to care? This is another great example. But as Linda and Ash have their moment, the Kandarian demon is stalking the cabin, pacing around Cheryl's window. It calls to her, "Join us." Cheryl's clearly not in her right mind because no one I know would dare walk into the forest barefoot like this. The imagery and shots of her walking into the woods are really, really good too. This leads to my least favorite scene in the whole movie. The tree grape scene is one of the main reasons why I rarely ever rewatch this film. It does not add anything to the plot, it's absolutely unnecessary. And apparently, the actress who played Cheryl, Ellen Sandwise, didn't even know the scene was going to happen, since she didn't actually film it. I mean, if you're going to include a scene like that, you should really tell the actor involved. But Raimi really regretted including this scene in the years that followed, which is why it is nowhere to be seen in Evil Dead 2 and onward in the series. Though a version of it would be included in the 2013 remake directed by Fede Alvarez, and I'm honestly not even sure why, but that's a topic for another time. Sam Raimi was in his early 20s at the time of making The Evil Dead, so it's safe to say that, like Stephen King while writing a certain infamous scene in It, that young Sammy was a bit of an edgy boy. Real quick, before we continue, I wanted to tell you all that I've totally revamped my Patreon with new Storyrant specific rewards. So if you're enjoying this video, head over to patreon.com/EricMalikyte and pledge $2 to $5 for a variety of rewards. Octal and I have big plans for future videos, and every dollar will help go toward making those videos even better. I'm also working on a found footage cosmic horror audio drama called the OEI Archives that will debut here on the channel before going to Spotify and other podcast platforms. And you can read the rough draft script for episode 1 on Patreon right now. Anyway, moving on. Cheryl frees herself and runs back to the cabin. The demon gives chase. Fun fact about this scene, Ellen Sandwise got seriously torn up while running through the woods here. They had 2x4s for her to run on, but the branches and undergrowth all tore and cut at her skin. So the cuts on her when she gets to the cabin door aren't makeup, they're real. What can I say? The 80s were a different time. When she gets back inside, Cheryl claims that the woods are alive. No one really believes her, but Ash agrees to take her into town so she doesn't have to stay the night in the cabin. At first, the car won't start. But as Cheryl says that the demon won't let them leave, the car starts back up at the last second.
You sassy bitch.
Ash drives Cheryl out of the campsite until the fog blocks the road. He gets out and checks the road up ahead. After some time, Cheryl gets out as well and walks the road, calling out to Ash until she discovers that the bridge has been destroyed. Back at the cabin, the group sits around trying to pass the time. Shelley and Linda attempt to predict what playing cards they're each holding, like ESP, and Ash is busy listening to the rest of the tape with an earbud? Yeah, apparently earbuds were invented in 1891. I had no idea. Dr. Nobi, reveals that his wife became host to a Kandarian demon. The only way to stop the evil is bodily dismemberment. Cheryl, standing by the window, begins predicting the cards Linda and Shelley are holding, and surprise, she awakens as a zombie. And yes, I say zombie because the term Deadite would not be invented until Evil Dead 2. The makeup is pretty cool, even though it's a lot more crude than what we'd eventually end up getting in Evil Dead 2 and onward. Fun fact about the contacts in the first two films, though, they weren't like modern ones and were basically made of a hard plastic. The actors were basically blind when in their zombie makeup, which is pretty wild. Scotty manages to get Cheryl into the cellar and locks it tight with chains. All of the camera work in this scene is pretty fun, too. I really love the POV shots in this movie. But this pencil scene, depending on whether or not you're watching this on Patreon or YouTube, is way more disturbing than I remember it being. And it's way more effective than the tree grape scene, in my humble opinion. This all leads to another POV stalking shot around the cabin, where the camera actually crashes through the window and gets Shelley. While it's a bit slow here, and I'm pretty sure this concept is executed better in subsequent films, it's still pretty inventive. We get some more fun choreography when Shelley attacks Scotty. He ends up having to stab his girlfriend in the back with a Kandarian dagger, and the thing starts smoking. I kind of wish this was retained in the following films, but maybe it was a pain in the ass to recreate. Everyone thinks Shelley's dead, but she comes to and backs Scotty and Ash into a corner. Ash is just standing there, holding the axe in disbelief, and it's Scotty who ends up having to hack his girlfriend to pieces. This is a really nice contrast to what Ash would become in the rest of the series. Ash and Scotty arguing over whether or not they should bury their friend is another nice touch, something we almost never see in these kinds of movies. Another genuine human moment to take note of. While Linda's sleeping, Ash and Scotty get into another fight about leaving. Ash mentions that Linda can't walk and Scotty just doesn't give a shit. Scott says that the trees won't let them leave and he's willing to leave her there while they flee. What a piece of crap. Ultimately, Scotty decides to leave without Ash. Ash goes to check on Linda, and when he pulls the blanket off her injured ankle, he watches a web of black veins spread out from the wound. A really creative and inventive effect. I love how stop motion, when done right, lends itself to making the audience feel off balance, to really selling an otherworldly or uncanny effect. And I think the point of special effects in a supernatural horror film should not be to make them look realistic, but to make them look dreamlike or uncanny. This is something that films like The Babadook do really well. And then Linda awakens as a zombie and just starts cackling in Ash's face. She sits there in the middle of the room while Ash paces, unsure what to do. The constant laughing is pretty fun, and almost feels like a precursor to the madness we'll see in Evil Dead 2. The constant cackling finally makes Ash snap, and he beats on his possessed girlfriend. Scotty returns and is a total mess. The trees did a number on him, but I'll bet they didn't violate him. He tells Ash he needs to kill Linda, and zombie Cheryl taunts Ash, telling him he can't do it. Ash points the boomstick at his girlfriend, but when she returns to normal, he drops the gun and goes to embrace her. Cheryl does the same thing from within the cellar, pleading with her brother to let her out. And Ash almost does it, until he notices that she's gone completely quiet. Cheryl punches through the floor and grabs his face. Linda resumes her cackling and Ash drags her outside, leaving her there while he retreats back into the cabin, and Ash starts to lose his mind. The scene where he gets all manic and tells Scotty everything's going to be okay, that they'll all get out of there alive, including Shelley. Well, not Shelley. Shelley's dead. Is really great, and Scotty dies mid-sentence. And even though he was a total piece of crap, it's pretty heartbreaking, because it's clear that all of this has taken a serious toll on Ash's sanity. Ash has basically lost everyone he cares about. Linda pops back up inside the cabin, scaring the crap out of Ash, stabbing him with the dagger and licking the blade. After struggling with her, Linda ends up falling on the dagger. It smokes, and she melts.
Well, it just so happens that your friend here is only mostly dead.
Ash drags her outside to the shed, perhaps our first glimpse at what Evil Dead would later become with the introduction of the chainsaw in a series of awesome cuts that would become its own visual gag in the next film, and would also influence Shaun of the Dead director Edgar Wright when he went to direct Hot Fuzz. With chainsaw in hand, Ash is about to dismember his girlfriend, but the sight of her necklace stops him. He ends up crying over her body. Yeah, Bruce is the best actor in this movie. Instead, he decides to bury her, but once the deed is done, he spots the necklace lying in the dirt. And Ash's hand getting grabbed by Linda actually made me jump on my rewatch. Linda and Ash duke it out, and Ash grabs this large plank of wood and proceeds to beat her with it. At one point, the plank actually breaks in half, and in the next scene, it's whole again. Just one of those fun movie mistakes. Ash decapitating Linda with a shovel was really well done, honestly. I was wondering how the hell they did that. It's also really fun that she just keeps laughing at him while her body writhes on top of him. He makes his way back inside the cabin and finds that the cellar has been forced open. Cheryl attacks him and ends up getting a taste of his boomstick. Ash locks the cabin down, but he needs shotgun shells, so he ventures down into the cellar, finding the shells and retreating back up the stairs. Eventually, though, he finds that the pipes are bleeding. In fact, the walls, the plugs, and even the light bulbs end up oozing in a really fun sequence that would be totally outdone in Evil Dead 2. The use of Dutch and varied shots is really great in the finale. Even though the cabin would literally come alive in Evil Dead 2, and that scene in particular is probably one of my favorite scenes in any horror film, it's still really well executed here when a similar thing happens. It's not as crazy as 2, but it really doesn't need to be. And seriously, the mirror puddle scene is incredible. How the hell did they do that? Ash takes out Linda's necklace and mourns her before zombie limbs punch through the wall and grab him. While struggling with the zombies, Ash spots the Book of the Dead near the fireplace. While they chew and beat him senseless on the ground, he uses the necklace to rope in the book. This works, and Ash grabs for the book, chucking it into the fire and killing the zombies. What comes next is an awesome stop-motion sequence where the zombies decompose. Seriously, we need more stop-motion in horror films, especially with how good it can look with go-motion setups and whatnot. If you thought this was the end, though, you'd be wrong, because as the zombies are falling apart and melting, demonic hands reach out from their bodies and rend anything they can get their claws on. It's a fantastic sequence, and I wish we had a Lovecraftian horror film that used inventive visuals like this. Like, seriously, hear me out. I could totally see a Dunwich horror adaptation doing something like this and it totally working. And while The Void is basically a Lovecraftian Evil Dead, this is something that I think hasn't been fully pushed to the limit yet on film. By the way, comment down below if you want a video on The Void. As Ash stands beaten and battered but alive, the demon calls out one last time as it fades away. Join us. The sun rises and Ash walks outside holding Linda's necklace. But then the POV camera smashes through the camera and the film ends with the demon getting Ash. The Evil Dead is an awesome film, despite that one scene and a few things that have shown their age. It's easy to see why it terrified viewers, impressed Stephen King, and dominated the VHS market, becoming one of the most stolen tapes at video stores of the era. But in 1987, Sam Raimi would come back swinging with one of the most inventive horror sequels or reboots that would ever grace the screen, creating an iconic horror comedy masterpiece, fully cementing his directorial style, and in my opinion, completely blowing the original film out of the water. The Evil Dead was a genuine cult phenomenon, but it wasn't able to really break through the public consciousness the way that Evil Dead 2 would end up doing, at least according to the cast and crew behind Evil Dead 2. But the crew didn't jump straight into making Evil Dead 2. In fact, Sam didn't want any part of doing a sequel at first. Instead, he worked on a film called Crime Wave, which was written for Bruce Campbell. The studio interfered and replaced Bruce, and really, Sam and his crew were miserable working in the studio system. The movie ended up being a major flop. But even with Crime Wave out of the way, Sam still didn't want to do Evil Dead 2. Josh Becker, one of the original crew members on the first film, even turned in a script for the would-be project, and Well, everyone hated it. Sam really only relented when it was clear to him they weren't going to get another movie from the studio system. So he pitched the movie to producer Dino De Laurentiis, and he agreed to finance the picture. They got access to a much larger budget this time around, and boy does it show. Evil Dead 2 was written by Sam Raimi and Scott Spiegel, and of course, I really don't have to mention who it's directed by, right? Just making sure you're still paying attention. Early on in the process, Raimi wanted to have a recap of the original film, but unfortunately was unable to get the rights from New Line Cinema. Eventually, it was decided to just reshoot those sequences. But as Bruce put it in the Swallowed Souls documentary,
it was two different companies. And they were like, well, let's just pretend that the first one didn't happen.
So basically, according to Campbell, it's best to go into Evil Dead 2 fresh, without considering the events of the original film. Or is it? Evil Dead 2 opens a bit differently than the first film. As I mentioned during the breakdown of the first film, the opening sequence is quite a bit shorter. It's just Ash and Linda in the car on the way up to the cabin, and we cut pretty quickly to just being at the cabin. There is no long arrival sequence. Things are pretty upbeat, all things considered, as these lovers get settled in. But there's also this neat little opening sequence, a history lesson of sorts that establishes the Necronomicon Ex Mortis. While the Book of the Dead still has many of the powers you remember from the first film, we have 3 new important takeaways from this opening sequence. 1. The sea once ran red with blood. 2. The book was inked with this blood. 3. And that it disappeared in 1300 AD. That last part is going to be really important later. After the drive up, we cut right to the cabin. Ash is playing the piano while Linda dances to the tune. Linda already has the necklace from the first movie. It's just implied that Ash gave it to her. Ash is pretty flippant about sneaking up to the cabin, and when Linda says she's nervous, he brushes her worries off, suggesting that the owners aren't going to be coming back, and even if they do, they'll just tell them that the car broke down or something. This version of Ash is already pretty different from the first film. He's a lot more confident and has no problem being a goofball. Ash goes into the other room to grab a bottle of wine and discovers a tape recorder. When he tells Linda about it, she suggests he find out what's on it, and he does. He presses play and we once again, for the first time, hear Professor Noby. He tells us that he, his wife Henrietta, and the rest of his crew have made a significant discovery in the castle of Kandar. He believes he's found the Natrum Demonto in the rear chamber. It's interesting that the opening sequence calls it the Necronomicon Ex Mortis, but here they use the original name of the book. So is he mistaken, or did they reuse the voiceover from the first film? Well, that's a complicated question to answer. We'll get into whether Evil Dead 2 really does erase what happened in the original film or not later. But I would like to pause here for a second and call out how Evil Dead as a series plays on many of the horror tropes we're familiar with. While Evil Dead 2 is certainly more traditional supernatural horror than cosmic, featuring such tropes as daylight banishing the entity when it possesses Ash later, spoilers, I guess, you could make an argument that there are some inherently Lovecraftian concepts working behind this film. This time, the evil is summoned by Noby's reading of the Forbidden Book, and it crashes right through the window and gets Linda in a sequence that should look very familiar. Remember when I talked about this concept being executed better in later installments? This is what I was talking about. The camera movement is much faster than the original films, probably because the film's budget is much larger. Ash goes to investigate what happened and finds the broken remnants of the window. Linda is nowhere to be found. He goes outside to look for her, and Linda goes from 0 to deadite in less than 60 seconds and attacks him. And we repeat the decapitation scene from the first film. I've always wondered how a shovel could ever possibly decapitate someone, and the answer is they probably can't. Not like this, anyway. But I'm almost surprised we didn't get a line from Ash like, "Guess they don't make shovels like they used to," or something, as he looks at the shovel in surprise. Honestly, though, it looks just as good as the original scene. It's just sped up quite a bit. Ash buries Linda and plants a gnarled wooden cross in the earth to mark her grave. And then the evil comes for Ash as dawn breaks upon the horizon. And now we've officially completed the truncated recap of the first film, and we can get into the sequel proper. Our final boy gets launched through the woods, slamming into branches and trees before falling into a puddle and reawakening as a deadite. I love the look of Deadite Ash, or Bad Ash, as I'll refer to him in the rest of this script.
Little goody two-shoes, little goody two-shoes, little goody two-shoes, little goody two-shoes.
The rising sun, however, beats back the evil and purges it from his body, leaving Ash in a state of shock. The fog retreats in another really fun and creative shot, even though you can tell the footage is playing backwards. Ash crossing his eyes and passing out is a lot of fun. Bruce is always entertaining on screen. Some time passes, and Ash wakes up, wondering what the fuck just happened to him. We get an arc shot of the woods. Kind of a juxtaposition of the first film shot of the cellar, in a way. And Ash decides to get out of there before nightfall. The cabin calls for him to join us. And he nopes the hell out of there in his car, only to discover that the bridge is out. Wait, haven't we been here before? He flips out and complains about the situation, yelling at the sky. He tells himself he's got to get a grip on himself, and then the sun immediately goes down in a really fun sequence. I just love how this sequence plays with the passage of time. I don't think any other actor would have been able to sell how this affects Ash's mental state. Okay, maybe Jim Carrey could do it. He's able to straddle the line between serious and goofy quite effectively when he wants to. The sun setting brings back the demon, and it goes after Ash. He jumps back in the car and races back to the cabin, but ends up crashing and flying through the windshield, because Sam Raimi just loves to abuse Bruce Campbell. Ash ends up having to run the rest of the way. He gets to the cabin, and the evil chases him inside in a really fun continuous shot that shows us the inner workings of the cabin. I just love how Raimi managed to push these POV shots even further in this film. The evil ends up not finding Ash and leaves the cabin, where it lurks in the woods. It's revealed that Ash hid in the cellar, and then we cut to our other characters arriving. Annie, Professor Noby's daughter, and Ed. Annie's collected pages from the Book of the Dead, and Ed remarks that they've not aged at all. Annie muses that her father's probably found nothing but just possibly a doorway to another world. Weird how the acting is better in this movie, isn't it? Back at the cabin, Ash is paranoid as fuck. He looks around the cabin with the utmost of caution. When he gets back to the living room, the piano begins playing by itself, a familiar tune, in fact. The same one that he was playing for Linda earlier. Ash takes out his girlfriend's necklace and breaks down. It's really amazing that all of this works, even though we've spent a lot less time with these characters. I rewatched this movie twice for this video, by the way. Once on its own after having not rewatched the original film in over 10 years, and once right after having rewatched the original. While the film certainly works as a sequel to the original film with some mental gymnastics, you don't really need to have seen the original to enjoy it, or even be moved by many of the more emotional scenes in the film. Frankly, it's surprising how well this film works from either viewpoint, and I'll explain why later. Ash sees a shadow on the wall and goes to the window, where he sees Linda's headless corpse dig itself out of her grave and perform a version of the dance from the first part of the film. The stop motion sequence here is a lot of fun and looks eerie as hell. Horror and stop motion go together like bread and butter, man. When done right, it's the stuff of nightmares. Linda dances off screen, leading to her scaring the crap out of Ash. She asks him to dance with her and grabs his head, allowing Ash to do a quick Three Stooges routine that expertly cuts to him screaming in the chair in the living room. This cut suggests that Ash might be an unreliable narrator in this film. Take note of this, as we'll be revisiting this concept later. Ash kind of deflates here, but is immediately surprised when Linda's head falls into his lap and bites his hand. He spends some time bashing her head into anything and everything he can in an attempt to free himself, but ultimately decides to take her head into the work shed and use the vise to finally free his hand. The Deadite taunts Ash, and he notices that the chainsaw is missing, a nice reversal of the first film scene revealing it. Linda's headless corpse comes in and tries to cut him to pieces, but things don't go according to plan in a really short but entertaining sequence that turns the tables on the headless Deadite. Ash is about to chainsaw Linda's evil head, but Linda pulls the old demon returns to normal to plead for their life shtick, and Ash hesitates for a second before she switches back to full-on Deadite and he finally goes through with the act, soaking the screen and the workshed in red. Man, I just love the way this film looks. Everything from the way it's shot, the lighting, the camera work, the props, and makeup. There probably isn't a film out there that has this visual identity. More films could stand to go full ham when it comes to their lighting. Simon Whistler once told me that shadows are cool, have lots of shadows in your background. And while he was clearly talking about my YouTube backdrop, I could not help but hear those words while admiring all the different shadows in every single shot of this movie. And it's true. If any of you are aspiring filmmakers, please play with shadows and lighting. It does so much for the visual mood of your projects, and can make a project go from looking amateur to looking like a work of art. Just don't do what the CW does on Superman and Lois. One thing I think that really helps this film's overall look is that it kind of uses stage lighting. Once upon a time, I wanted to be a comic book artist, so I picked up Scott McCloud's Making Comics, and he's got a whole section in that book breaking down how to use lighting to enhance the tone and mood of a story. He was talking about comic books, but the same lesson can easily be applied to filmmaking. And I know that sounds really fucking obvious, but understand, I'm not a director or filmmaker. Well, not yet anyway. I'm a writer and artist. Anyway, Ash gets back inside, finds the shotgun, and immediately ditches the chainsaw. Then the chair in the living room creaks and turns to face him. He approaches it slowly as it rocks by itself, aims the gun at it at first, and then decides to stop the rocking by touching it. But before he can touch the chair, it stops rocking entirely. This freaks Ash out, and he drops the gun. He goes to the mirror, and we get a brand new mirror gag, with Ash reaching through the mirror and grabbing himself. "We just cut up our girlfriend with a chainsaw. Does that sound odd?" Mirror Ash chokes Good Ash, and he wakes up on the floor with his hands wrapped around his own throat. And then the hand Linda bit goes bad, featuring a similar ink-spreading stop-motion effect that we saw in the first film with Linda's ankle. And Ash proceeds to fight with his own hand for the next 10 minutes or so, and it's one of the greatest things ever. Also, I've always wondered if Liar Liar was referencing this scene when Jim Carrey's character tries to lie about the pen's color. We immediately cut to Ed and Annie arriving at the bridge, discovering that it's a total wreck. This introduces us to our other two characters, Jake and Bobby Joe. Bobby Joe and Jake agree to take Annie and Ed to the cabin by guiding them through the trail, for a price. Annie agrees to pay them $100 so long as Jake carries her luggage. She honestly looks kind of devious when Jake's looking at the pages of the book. She's got a huge trunk in the back that he has to carry. Back at the cabin, Ash has fallen asleep by the kitchen sink. His evil hand begins smashing dishes over his head, waking him up and restarting the fight. Bruce went all out in this sequence, smashing his head into things and flipping himself all over the place. Ash gets knocked out, but the hand quote-unquote spots the cleaver in the distance and drags Ash over to it in a sequence that always makes me laugh. But Ash stops his hand by stabbing himself with a kitchen knife. Bruce totally sells that he's both in severe pain and gloating, even as he cuts his evil hand off with a chainsaw. I love this movie. Bobby Joe, Ed, Annie, and Jake, who is complaining about carrying a massive trunk on his back, arrive at the cabin. Ash traps his squirming evil hand under a bucket and weighs it down with some books. He uses some duct tape, because duct tape fixes everything, to bandage his stump up, but as he's doing so, his hand makes a run for it. And Ash panics, grabbing the gun and going after it. He hears all kinds of sounds that throw him off, but then sees it scuttling across the floor after a rat, and Ash shoots the place up. At one point, the hand even gets caught in a rat trap and flips Ash off. You can really tell they just had so much fun in this sequence. Ash finally thinks he's killed his hand as it moans through the wall. The wall begins bleeding, but does not stop. This leads to another really fun sequence, calling back to the one where the walls bleed in the original film. But this time, it comes out like a fucking fire hose. The blood turns black before retreating into the wall. Overwhelmed, Ash goes to sit down, but the chair breaks, and literally, the whole cabin comes alive to laugh at him. This is honestly one of my favorite sequences in the whole film. The Dutch angle, the way the lamp and the deer head are animated, everything. It's just so well done. And once again, Bruce Campbell's performance here straddles the line between ridiculous and dramatic and makes the whole thing feel believable. As it's happening, Ash's mind finally breaks and he starts laughing with the inanimate objects in the cabin. And then the scene goes from Looney Tunes to dramatic as his laughter transforms into a pained cry. But everything goes quiet when Ash hears something at the door, instantly transitioning away from this madness in a way that feels like we're meant to question if it even happened at all. The pacing in this movie is on point. So good. Ash's response to hearing something at the door is to shoot whatever is on the other side. And honestly, can we really blame him at this point? When he opens the door to investigate, no one's there. But the moment he lets his guard down, Jake tackles Ash to the floor and knocks him out, but not before our boy gets in a few good hits. And Ed also has to hold him down. Look, he's just too much man for all these people, okay? Bobby Joe comes in holding her shoulder, followed by Annie. Jake asks if Ed knows the bastard on the floor. Annie asks where her parents are, and seeing the bloody chainsaw on the floor, she jumps straight to the conclusion that this asshole murdered her parents and begins shaking him down for answers. Jake spots the trap door and drags Ash over to it. Ash realizes he's made a mistake and pleads for them to not throw him down there. And this line totally got me. "You damn right, you flat-mouthed son of a bitch." I just have to wonder why Jake thinks this is a worthy insult. Annie then plays her father's tape, revealing that Henrietta has become host to a Kandarian demon. Nobi could not bring himself to dismember her corpse, so he buried her in the cellar. And then Ash sees Henrietta come out of the ground, played to perfection by Ted Raimi, Sam Raimi's brother. Ash pleads for them to let him out, and they scramble to rescue him as Henrietta slowly approaches. Henrietta gives everyone some trouble, beating up Jake and Ed before Ash smashes the cellar door on top of her head, popping an eyeball out of her possessed skull, and, well, in true Sam Raimi fashion, it flies through the air like a golf ball and goes right down a screaming Bobby Joe's mouth. This brings to mind a video I watched from Cosmonaut Variety Hour on the Raimi Spider-Man films. Sam do be loving them screaming ladies. While everyone's regrouping, the evil comes charging at the cabin. Ash tells everyone that there's something out there, and that the witch in the cellar is only part of it. It lives in the woods, in the dark. Something that's come back from the dead. But Ash tells them that they can't leave until sunrise, like that worked out so well for him last time. And then Henrietta starts singing Hush Little Baby, reverting to Henrietta's human form. She begs Annie to open the cellar, but Ash grabs Annie's arm and shakes his head. Annie proclaims that the thing in the cellar is not her mother, and Ed jump scares us, revealing he's become a deadite. He floats in the air and proclaims that we are the things that were and shall be again. We want what is yours, life. And this is a really interesting thing for them to say. We don't get a lot of information about the evil in the entire Evil Dead series, at least the parts that featured this version of Ash. And before you comment about stuff in the third season of Ash vs. Evil Dead, hold that thought, because I haven't seen it, and we're really only focused on the movies for the purposes of this video. While Evil Dead 2 could be taken as a generic zombie/demonic possession film with the charms of Sam Raimi, I don't think that's the only way to view it. This line and some other clues in the film seem to suggest that these things are much older than your typical depiction of what a demon is. It's almost Lovecraftian in contrast to the first film's take on the same thing, which is kind of unsurprising given that Raimi renamed the grimoire after H.P. Lovecraft's famous creation, the Necronomicon. While this film probably does not qualify as cosmic horror, it definitely has some tropes from the genre, and I'd say it still qualifies as eldritch horror. The Deadites proclaim that everyone will be dead by dawn, and Demon Ed attacks everyone. Ash runs off to get something, and Annie calls him a coward, like he totally wasn't the one who knocked Henrietta back into the cellar. She does apologize for misjudging Ash, but still. Ash comes back with an axe and chops Ed to pieces. The group huddles close as they assess the situation. Later, Jake's watching the trail from the window and notices that something's wrong. It's disappeared, like the woods just swallowed her up. Annie is looking around and notices the clock's pendulum stop, and then everything becomes uncomfortably quiet. And folks, this is a masterclass in how to use sound and the lack thereof to mess with your audience's expectations. Everyone is extra wary, and Annie says what everyone's thinking by pointing out how quiet it is, and the evil proves it's a giant troll by making all the noise it possibly can, like it's driving its nails against the chalkboard of the universe. Ash comments that something is trying to force its way into their world, also a very Lovecraftian concept. Also, clear foreshadowing is clear. The door to the bedroom opens. Everyone considers what to do next. Ash suggests they should all go in together, and then Jake says, "Hell no, you're the curious one." Ash is about to go it alone, but Annie totally redeems herself, saying she'll join him, where they find nothing. Jake comes in with Bobby and proclaims there ain't nothing in there to be scared of, and then Professor Noby appears as an apparition, where he tells them all that their salvation lies in the pages of the book that Annie brought with her. They have to recite the passages and dispel the evil dead. And, save his soul. And then, my favorite character in this film returns. That's right, Ash's evil hand. The way this is done is really fun, too. At first, Bobby Joe tells Jake he's hurting her hand, but Jake reveals that he's not holding her hand anymore. The reveal is pretty great. Everyone freaks out, Bobby Joe smacks the lantern out of Annie's hand, and everything goes dark. When the light comes back on, Bobby Joe is running screaming into the woods. The trees come alive and attack her, complete with vines lashing out and grabbing her limbs. And once she's all wrapped up like an eldritch Christmas present, she's dragged through the woods and disappears. Notice that I didn't say that the trees graped her, because they don't. Sam Raimi regretted including that sequence in the first film and went out of his way to omit it. And honestly, good on him. Jake, being desperate to find Bobby Joe, demands that everyone go out there and help search for her. And then Ash retorts with, "If she went out into those woods, you can forget about it." And then we cut to Annie, who's holding one of the pages from the Necronomicon depicting a guy in a blue shirt with a chainsaw arm pointing to the sky. She tells Ash that he was prophesied to destroy the evil. And not missing a beat, Ash says, "Didn't do a very good job." If you've seen Army of Darkness, then this is really, really fucking funny. Annie says that saying the words in the first passage will summon a physical representation of the evil, and the second passage will create a rift in time and space, but this means that it can be forced back into the rift. But Jake has other plans. He cocks the shotgun and turns it on Ash and Annie. Jake proclaims himself to be in charge now and snatches up the pages from the book, dropping them in the cellar, and then he forces them to go outside. The trees moving in the background look really good. It doesn't look real, but it just looks really fun and creepy. Jake reaches the place where the trail should be, and we're led to think that the evil is coming right for him. But after a nice moment of silence, Ash awakens as Bad Ash and beats the ever-living shit out of Jake. And this is another awesome sequence with fun choreography. Eventually, Annie gets the Kandarian dagger and waits for Ash to attack inside the cabin. She hears the door rattling and delivers some accidental karma to Jake when she stabs him. She apologizes for what she's done, but Jake's not having any of it and demands she pull it out. This was a terrible idea. You never remove a knife like that. Jake complains about not being able to breathe because he's an idiot and should have just left the knife in, as Annie drags him back into the living room. Annie spots the axe on the floor and drags Jake the rest of the way into the living room, leaving him by the cellar. Henrietta takes that bait and pops Jake's torso like a grape, in the process creating a comical spray of blood, one that almost drowned Dan Hicks the first time they tried it. Bad Ash makes his way back in and spots Annie's body on the ground. He's about to finish her off when he finds Linda's necklace on the ground. He picks it up, and this forces him to regain his senses, willing the evil out of his body in another well-executed sequence. I don't know what Hollywood was thinking when they basically rejected Bruce Campbell as a leading man for Darkman and Crime Wave, thinking that he just couldn't handle a role like that. What were they on? Cocaine, probably. There was a lot of cocaine in the 80s. I could point to any number of scenes where he displays top-tier acting chops. This one in particular stands out because you can really feel his transformation and conflict. Ask yourself how many actors could actually pull this off without it feeling forced. Anyway, Ash passes out and wakes up to an axe being swung at his face area. Annie still thinks he's a deadite. Ash pleads with her at first, but when it's clear she's not buying it, he catches the axe instead. She tries for one last swing before he finally convinces her he's all right. But for how long? Ash says, "Let's go down into the cellar and carve ourselves a witch." This leads to one of the greatest scenes in movie history. I don't know how a single scene can be all things silly, hilarious, horrific, and badass, but the sequence where Ash attaches the chainsaw to his stump is all of those things and more. The sharp cuts are all so well executed. Seriously, this scene alone is worth the price of entry, even if you don't like these kinds of movies.
Groovy.
Meanwhile, the trees are up to no good. They're doing something weird by pulling their own roots out of the ground. Honestly, this all just looks really cool. Ash cuts open the trap door and they enter the cellar. They immediately find one of the pages, but sounds are coming from the other side of the cellar door. The set is an awesome recreation of the original basement, which, remember, was probably in ruins at the time of filming, due to that, lightning bolt that struck the cabin and reduced it to ashes. We get a jump scare with a skeleton. Fun fact, this skeleton is probably real, since most films opt to use the real thing instead of trying to make them. So think about that the next time you watch Poltergeist. Ash finds the rest of the pages and decides to get the hell out of there. He backs up the whole way, making the audience think that Henrietta is going to show up behind him, but that never happens. He hands the pages up to Annie and guards the stairs. Henrietta grabs his legs and destroys the stairs, using Ash's body as a battering ram before moving upstairs to deal with Annie. She grabs Annie's hair and begins floating around the room. Ash emerges from the cellar, finally earning his heroic theme. Then Henrietta and Ash fight in yet another fun and slapstick-heavy sequence, culminating in her head transforming into a grotesque long-neck thing that makes monkey sounds. The claymation is pretty fun here too. But Annie comes in clutch just as things are looking dire for Ash by singing Hush Little Baby, distracting deadite Henrietta long enough for Ash to cut her to pieces. Annie breaks down, and Ash comes to comfort her, but not before spinning the shotgun like the badass he's become. They have a moment, and then the trees start beating the shit out of the cabin. Even though you can tell it's a model, the cuts are really fun in this sequence, and honestly, it really shows how even obviously fake effects can be made to look that much better with the right cuts and camera work. The living trees rip open the cabin door. Man, these trees look awesome. Annie's reading of the first passage summons a physical representation of the evil, and it looks really fucking awesome. I honestly have to give it to the props and special effects department. This stuff holds up super well. And again, not because it looks real. I mean, they're all in-camera effects, so they do look like they're actually there, but at this point, you know what I mean. When Ash lays eyes on this thing, part of his hair goes white, another Lovecraftian trope. He tells Annie not to look at it, to just read the rest of the words. The tree hands grab Ash and drag him toward the evil's mouth. Ash's evil hand returns and stabs Annie in the back before she can finish reciting the words. Ash stabs the evil head in the eye with his chainsaw arm, but Annie proves she's a total badass, and with the last of her will completes the passage, summoning a portal in time and space before finally dying. For a moment, Ash thinks they've finally won as the evil is dragged into the portal. But Ash gets sucked into the vortex too. The next thing he knows, he's transported back to the 13th century as a deadite is attacking a bunch of knights. He kills the deadite with his boomstick and laments his plight as the knights celebrate the arrival of the prophesied hero of the sky. Awesome fucking movie. But is this a remake or a sequel? Is it both? Yes and no, and yes again. It's interesting to note that we never see the Necronomicon in this movie. Personally, while I've always taken this film and Army of Darkness as their own thing in the past, I'm leaning toward it being both. While the first 7 minutes of the film do appear to retcon the events of the first film, we get many clues throughout the runtime of 2 that lead us to believe that Ash has kind of lost it and might be an unreliable narrator. This view of the events of the film can be further backed up if you take Ash vs. Evil Dead into account too, since it's later revealed that Ash is believed to be a serial killer who hacked up his girlfriend, sister, and friends at the cabin, meaning the events of the first film are canon. It's entirely possible that Ash is now remembering the events of the first film differently now, and this honestly makes the film a little more fun in my opinion. Bruce Campbell, while talking about making the second film, suggests that Ash died at the end of the movie. But we never see this actually happen. Honestly, if you can get through the tree grape scene in the first film, and if you can't, I totally understand that, I'd say watch them both. And if not, you can easily take the events of the second film as canon. It works both as a sequel and a standalone work, which, again, is honestly really impressive. So many sequels try to do this and fail miserably. While Evil Dead 2's themes are pretty simple, and the film serves as a fun action horror comedy romp, its most complex theme being the arrogance and hubris of the sciences, you know the Lovecraft quote. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little. But someday the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality, and of our frightful position therein, and we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. The film really doesn't try to say anything profound in regard to this theme, and it serves more as a vehicle or catalyst for the struggle of good versus evil. And that's really all it needs to be. Even though those themes are simple, it did pioneer some popular horror tropes that we'd see repeated in other films. The biggest being the selfish goofball hero, of course, and the film is more than likely the codifier of the badass transplant trope, where a character gains power through a mechanical device rather than their own innate abilities, i.e. a chainsaw arm or leg gun. And these would appear in films like Shaun of the Dead, The World's End, and Drag Me to Hell, which I'm mentioning more because it's a seriously underrated Sam Raimi flick and you should watch it. Evil Dead 2: Dead by Dawn was a huge success, though not really financially at first. While it only grossed a hair under $6 million against a budget of $3.5 million, it had a huge cultural impact. So while you could say it wasn't a huge success in comparison to the original at the box office, it apparently did very well when it was released on VHS. I say apparently because I couldn't find any financial information to back this up, but it is what folks like Oliver Harper say, so hey, there you go. But you don't really need a source to back up the idea that Evil Dead 2 made a huge impact culturally, especially when it comes to how it influenced future horror films and movie making in general. Without it, we would not have gotten Cabin in the Woods, Edgar Wright's Cornetto trilogy, Peter Jackson's Dead Alive, Tucker and Dale vs. Evil, which deserves its own video, honestly, The Babysitter, and probably a bunch of other films I'm not remembering or haven't seen yet. And there probably isn't a horror film that hasn't been touched by it in some way. Hell, Evil Dead's influence is all over superhero films too, and not just the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films. You can also probably argue that if Sam Raimi hadn't made Army of Darkness, then Peter Jackson probably wouldn't have been able to make Lord of the Rings, or at the very least, those films might have looked very different, since fantasy films were not at all the highly sought-after commodity that they later became after Lord of the Rings, and that is likely thanks in no small part due to Army of Darkness becoming a cult success. Hell, the Battle of Helm's Deep can arguably be seen as a homage, in part, to the climactic battle at the end of Army of Darkness. And horror films and horror comedies continue to be influenced by Sam Raimi. The director for Renfield, which was a pretty fun film all things considered, and you should definitely watch it, just ignore the reviews, just go in blind, you'll have a good time, recently came out and said that he was partly influenced by Sam Raimi. And also, Evil Dead 2's effects were pretty damn groundbreaking for the time too. Some of today's most legendary makeup artists worked on the film. While we'd seen body horror in films like The Thing, Alien, and the Blob remake, which is an awesome movie and you should watch it, just ignore this dude's extremely distracting mullet. And also, let me know down in the comments if you want a video on the Blob remake. I don't think people had seen anything quite like what Sam Raimi was offering before it. So I guess to conclude this video before it overstays its welcome, Evil Dead 2 is one of the most influential films of all time, regardless of genre, and it's clear it will continue to inspire filmmakers and writers like myself for many years to come. But is it the greatest horror film ever made? Whether you think so or not is an entirely subjective opinion, much like all media analysis. But there's really no argument against it being one of the most influential films of all time, having inspired countless writers and artists in the decades since its release. It's firmly cemented its impact on pop culture and stood the test of time. And look, I'm just saying, not many films can remain relevant for nearly 40 years. But don't take my word for it. Watch the movie for yourself and tell me what you think in the comments. Do you agree with me? Do you prefer Evil Dead 2 or do you prefer the original? Let me know down below. I try to read and respond to most of the comments, at least when they're reasonable. And yes, even the ones that disagree with me. You're allowed to disagree with me, and in fact, I encourage it. Just think out your responses so we can have a good conversation on the subject. And before we end this video, I've gone ahead and totally revamped my Patreon with new Storyrant specific rewards. So head over to patreon.com/EricMalikyte and pledge $2 to $5 for a variety of rewards. Octal and I have big plans for future video essays, and every dollar will help go toward making these videos even better. I'm also working on a found footage cosmic horror audio drama called the OEI Archives that will debut here on the channel before going to Spotify and other podcast platforms. And you can read the rough draft script for episode 1 on Patreon right now. Thank you all so much for your continued viewership and support. Even if you can't help us out monetarily, the fact that you're even here means so much to us. With that said, I'm Eric Malikyte, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboys.